Hi, okay. My name is Hannah. I prefer she or pronouns, and I'll take POIs verbally. Starting my speech in 3, 2. It's the fact that the nuclear bomb has only once been used once in history and never again that goes to prove the sheer regret that exists and the immorality has been universally recognized when it comes to utilizing the nuclear bomb. It's the fact that country tensions have risen exponentially since the development of nuclear weapons, or the fact that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, if not for regular diplomacy, that World War III was on the brink of occurring, that goes to prove the terrible existence of nuclear weapons, never been prouder to oppose. A couple of things I'm going to do in this speech, but firstly, a couple of points on framing. No, this House prefers motion. I mean, it's an alternate reality in which nuclear weapons were never developed and also never used even in the future. So, for example, the US would have never used the atomic bomb on Japan in World War II that took thousands of hundreds of lives. And the Russia would have also never be able to have the capacity to use their presence of an atomic bomb to threaten the world with from intervening in Ukraine. But two, what would militaries then look like on our side? And here we want to preempt opposition's claims that different weapons would be developed in a world without nuclear weapons. I think sure, maybe, but the point of the argument in this debate is that no weapon that uses nuclear weapons would ever be developed and used that has similar capacity to nuclear weapons. But two, the umbrella of nuclear weapons realistically involves other weapons of the same capacity as nuclear weapons. And the first reason for this is because an opposition team that would claim otherwise symmetricizes the entire round if a weapon akin to nuclear weapons exists on both sides. But two, that the invention of a nuclear weapon by the US is what caused militaries to engage in an arms race to develop greater military weapons. So if the US didn't drop the atomic bomb in 1945, we think this wouldn't happen in the first place. We didn't think that other countries would have also raced to develop the atomic bomb or develop other biological and chemical weapons. We think that even if this wasn't true, we think getting rid of one devastating weapon that kills millions is something that is good regardless. First argument then on the immorality of nuclear weapons on just a principle level. I think if you just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened between Cuba and between the Soviet Union and US, the issue with nuclear weapons is that the moment you send off one, you trigger risking every country to send their nuclear weapons, which is why global relations are just so tense right now. I think on a principle level, just having this ever-present threat of a nuclear World War III that could end in complete destruction of everything is in itself something that we don't want to have present in the world. But two, on a practical level, it is not fair to have people to have to live their lives in fear. That is to say that even if people do not ever get it bombed, as long as the risk is present, you will always live in fear of getting bombed by another country in an instant and having your life ended without the potential of evacuation, as would happen in most ground conflicts. But most importantly, then onto the second argument as to why smaller countries who lack nuclear weapons are easily victimized in a world that has this. And the premise here is that not all countries who have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons or are allowed to develop such weapons in the first place. I know often that most smaller countries are often deterred from developing their own nuclear weapons. So, for example, if you look at the JCPOA deal and how the US constantly tried to force Iran into stopping their development of nuclear weapons, where most Western countries stigmatize smaller countries developing their own nuclear weapons like North Korea, or the fact that US has repeatedly sanctioned India for their own development of nuclear weapons, even though they promised not to use it unless attacked first, it's clear evidence that they don't want these other
One
countries to be able
information.
to have it. But two, even if smaller countries wanted to, they often do not have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons for reasons that they lag behind in development, for reasons like colonialism, or the fact that their resources were often stripped by larger empires and countries. Why is this then bad? I think on a principle level, it is incredibly hypocritical for big nations to discourage smaller countries from developing their own nuclear weapons because even they refuse to get rid of their own nuclear arsenal. Countries like France, the US, Russia, and China, they still all have their own nuclear weapons that they don't get rid of or destroy. But two, we think on a larger level, this creates several global imbalances that often increases conflict and tensions. So for example, it looks like Russia's fearlessness in invading Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons that they can attack Russia back with, and they're also not part of NATO, which means they can't intervene. So imagine if China decides to strike Taiwan at some point, and the sheer power imbalance exists within the country that does have nuclear weapons and a country that doesn't. But on a secondary level, it also looks like the US not being able to
More
intervene
information.
or NATO not being able to send troops to Ukraine currently for fear that Russia will use nuclear weapons and the conflict will expand. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing if there are any. From opening.
Can you name at least one conflict that happened between a small country and a big country that is not Russia and Ukraine that involved nuclear weapons?
I think it's the fact that even if you look at China and Taiwan right now, the potential for these kinds of conflicts to occur means that there is always going to be conflicts right now between larger countries and smaller countries either way. But on a secondary level, even outside of conflicts, I think it looks like the US not being able to intervene or NATO being able to send troops to Ukraine for fear that Russia will use nuclear weapons and the conflict will expand. This means that that's also why partially and why Ukraine continuously has conflict even today and other countries are unable to support it. But this also means that in the future, nuclear weapons can always be used as a bargaining power for larger countries to consistently threaten smaller countries into things like unfair agreements or to purposely or coerce them into allying together. What is the comparative then on when we do not have nuclear weapons? I think either way, irrespective of what method used, countries know that wars are likely to cause massive amounts of death. The difference then in this debate is this. Nuclear weapons cause massive amounts of instant destruction. So if a country gets bombed, it is near impossible to retaliate given the amount of destruction. But on the other hand, even if inequalities exist on our side in terms of size, non-nuclear weapons don't cause destruction as fast, and they're very easy to handle when it comes to things like diplomacy or negotiations, which is why countries have far bigger capacity to still minimize the harm in the event of conflict by evacuating citizens or buying time for negotiations. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech calling upon the leader of opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
And I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge and precise justice is permanent injustice. So in the realm of global security, relying on this fragile balance of nuclear deterrence is what led us to have a state of equilibrium and prevent the international corruption, right? 3 things to do from OO, right? First, on stance. Second, on deterrence and international security. Finally, on global stability, right? Okay, now on to stance, right? First thing, we support the current world with nuclear weapons. And secondly, we support current regulations that have naturally emerged regarding the usage of nuclear weapons in the status quo, such as like International Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, right? Now, our argument is very simple. It's on deterrence and international security. The premise being nuclear weapons serve and have retrospectively served as a powerful deterrent against potentially aggressors because the fear of mutually asserted destruction has, right, historically contributed to global stability by preventing this large-scale conflict between these nuclear-armed nations, right? Without nuclear weapons, we think that it would be more significantly likely that countries might be more like inclined to engage in conventional warfare, leading to increased instability and higher likelihood of large-scale conflict. But no thank you, Wise, it's true, right? A, without nuclear deterrence, it is likely that countries might be more inclined to resort to conventional warfare, right? What does it mean, right? The absence of a threat of devastating retaliation can embolden this nation to actually pursue an aggressive territorial ambitions or settle distribute through military means, right? This shift from nuclear to conventional conflicts poses a direct threat to global stability, right? For instance, let's just look at the Cold War era, where this competition between the United States and Soviet Union exemplifies this power of nuclear deterrence, right? And this idea that any nuclear conflict would result in total annihilation of both attacker and the defender, right? This is what creates a strategic stalemate that discourages both superpowers from entailing direct military confrontations, right? This means that there will be no state or any treaty that seeks for equilibrium. Our side is at the side that actually has knife in their pocket but only serve for deterrence, right? But on the second layer, right, in a world without any nuclear weapon, this balance of power dynamics can be fundamentally altered, right? What does it mean? The nuclear armed nations would lose the tool of quote unquote safeguarding their national interest. In a sense, this is what leads to power vacuum or realignment of alliance that both sides never wanted, right? But unfortunately, this side on this side opposite propositions. Oh no, thank you. On the other hand, there's a side the resulting in geopolitical instability, and this is what heightened the risk of large-scale conflict as nations will feel compelled to pursue their objective through force, right? And this is what lacks the deterrence effect provided by nuclear scenarios. Let's just look at even the status quo, right? There's this big rivalry between India and Palestine has never tempered to some extent by their nuclear capabilities, right? And there's this fear of mutually asserted, right, the destruction. And that is what has, no thank you, restrained both nations from escalating conflict to a full-scale war, right? There's what protects us from having deterrence, right? In a world without nuclear weapon, historical conflicts such as India, Palestinian war might have even seen different outcome with the potential for more aggressive military strategies. And I'll take your POI.
Historically, on-the-ground conflict didn't stop because of the development of nuclear weapons. They stopped because of the horrors of war itself that most people witnessed after World War I and World War II, meaning war isn't really a viable possibility anyway.
First of all, that is not true. But secondly, it is less likely to exist on our side because we have nuclear weapon that acts as a deterrence, right? And this is the entire point of our argumentation, right? But Judge, coming back to the point, why is this so round-winning, right? Second layer, 2 layers, right? A, there's this prevention of international war, right? Notice how in the status quo, in a nuclear armed war, there's this categoric potential of a nuclear acts as a strong deterrent against the initiation conflict that escalate the uncontrollably, thereby preventing the immense loss of life. There's environmental devastation, economic collapse that a world war would entail, right? But a second layer, on a very large level, on a winning level, right? There's this maintenance of global order and stability. We've already mechanized throughout my entire speech that this will create the power of balance, and this balance is so crucial insofar as this preventing the kind of power vacuum or realignment that historically have led to major wars, right? In a world without any nuclear weapons, which is like population world, there won't be more frequent and severe like conflicts as nations via for power and influences, right? And this is what potentially leads to widespread instability and chaos. And this is none of the sign once, right? But what does it actually mean, right? There's where countries are less likely to engage in aggressive military actions if there's a high risk that escalates could lead to a nuclear conflict, right? Now those aggressors kept away from the aggressiveness, right? Let's just look at US and Russia. Although they're foe for literally centuries and decades, right? Both have nuclear weapons. Both sides have refrained from escalating the conflict into a full-scale war. And this can be another exemplary of this deterrence. So Judge, we tell you that imprecise justice is a permanent injustice. For all this, which I'm so proud to post.
I thank the leader of opposition for their speech, calling upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Yeah, can you hear me and see me?
Yes,
Cool.
whenever you're ready.
He and pronouns, verbal POIs. 3, 2, 1. At the top of this speech, I want to disprove the majority of OO's claims as to why nuclear weapons means that you have less wars because of mutually assured destruction. I think what is notable is that probably countries anyways don't want to go to war, and it's really not contingent on whether they have nuclear weapons or not. The fact that you're going to war in the first place means you're risking millions of lives of citizens, you're risking escalation and possibly your career as a politician. So what is notable is that irrespective of whether you have nuclear weapons or not, wars are likely to cause massive devastating wars, and independent of whether nuclear weapons exist, this fact remains true. The conclusion of this is this, that we don't necessarily need nuclear weapons as a form of deterrence, that many other weapons exist, that countries are aware, even if they aren't as developed as nuclear weapons, have the capacity to cause immense harm, and that enough was a deterrent for you engaging within wars. The main claim from opening opposition then is this, that nuclear weapons do things like mutually assured destruction, and it deters conflict. Even if what I pointed out in the beginning was not symmetric, here are a few other reasons as to why nuclear weapons don't necessarily cause deterrence. Response 1 is that this worsens conflict. And the structural reason is because this hinders our ability to intervene in conflicts and end them because of the threat of nuclear weapons. Alex can say that we need to give an example other than Russia and Ukraine, but that example remains true, which is that a lot of countries are just unable to end the conflict and have to prolong the conflict by only giving minor forms of aid because Russia keeps threatening that any other increased form of aid will mean that Russia will bomb them nuclearly. Response 2, that yes, nuclear weapon regulation exists within status quo, but no country really follows this. That North Korea developed nuclear weapons anyways, so not all countries choose to follow it. It's really unclear as to the extent in which these regulations are effective. And importantly, countries like Iran and Pakistan also engage within such activities as well. They develop nuclear weapons anyways, so in most instances, it is something that is ineffective. Response 3, that even if the regulation is effectively enforced, we flipped this argument and said that it was something that was bad. And this is where first speaker of opening opposition largely neglects the majority of Hannah's constructive claim, that it perpetuates things like inequalities across different countries, that while some countries with nuclear weapons are able to enforce this policy of non-nuclear weapon proliferation, other countries that don't have nuclear weapons are bullied when doing things like negotiations. So it takes away power from larger powers if we have a world without nuclear weapons, and within negotiations, we don't have smaller countries being threatened with nuclear weapons. And the weighing of this argument was this. It was really important in the round that this argument is independent of whether nuclear wars are likely or less likely, because even if that clash was a deadlock, independent of that, negotiations on our side were able to protect vulnerable actors, that countries and smaller countries no longer have to be bullied, because importantly, even if opening opposition points out that still inequalities within the military exist, these countries don't have to be scared of the immense amount of harm that could be caused in an instant, that maybe they could engage in short-term conflict with the country, but also bank on the fact that they can be now bankrolled by a different country that has interest against it. So what that means then is that smaller, more vulnerable actors no longer have to be bullied within negotiations by the threat of nuclear conflict, which means that now larger powers no longer have the ability to, like, I don't know, bully smaller powers as much. The last thing I want to note then is that not all countries have nuclear weapons, which means mutually assured destruction doesn't
Information.
Clearly, some countries have nuclear weapons, other smaller countries don't, and don't always fall under nuclear umbrellas. And in those instances, we think these countries are those that are the most vulnerable actors in this round that were not protected by side opposition bench. Before I move on to the second part of our principle that was unresponded to, I'll take your point.
How would conflict between large superpowers look like in your world?
Yeah, so either way, like we pointed out, it leads to massive harm. So either it means border skirmishes because no country is willing to sacrifice so many lives in the instance of a war, or you don't have conflict anyways. Again, mutually assured destruction is symmetric to both sides. Very odd POI. Second, in terms of the principle then, and what we noted in the principle is this: independent of everything in the round so far, it is something that is principally unjustified for countries to develop weapons such as the nuclear weapon that has the ability to destroy a lot of the things. Sure, we still do have a military, but what that meant was that those things like the military didn't have as much of a capacity to cause as immense harm as quickly. That it was principally unjustified for us to force individuals to live in fear that the moment they get nuclear bombed, it would mean that, like, I don't know, they would potentially lose their lives. Sure, maybe this is symmetric to conventional weapons such as just normal bombing, but what is important is that these citizens can at least have the reassurance that they can do things like evacuate. But with the thing with nuclear weapons is that it is very hard to evacuate a certain area, given that not only do evacuations take time, but even if you did evacuate, the amount of time that it took could mean that in that moment, like, a nuclear weapon could hit, and even if you did evacuate, it would cause immense harm to you. So the principled clash in this round was that independent of anything in the round, we ought not develop a weapon and continue to have a weapon that could cause immense harm. And even if other weapons did so as well, it is something that is principally justified to take away a weapon and then arm a way that could take away the lives of millions. I think we won this debate on all grounds from side government.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech, calling upon the DLO here.
Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, when we are ready.
All right. He and pronouns, role POIs. 3, 2, 1. Two things in my speech. First, on OG's case. Second, on bringing back our first argument on deterrence. And second argument on international security and stability. Firstly, on OG. Even before their arguments, I just want to offer some recharacterization because I think Ethan employs too much of his imagination in a prefers world round to somehow assume that everyone will be in doomsdays on our side of the house. It is just factually untrue that nuclear weapons have been the cause of and main cause of increased tensions in the status quo. They point to the example of the Cuban missile crisis. What happened after? Tensions actually significantly lowered between US and Russia. Look at the New START Treaty and the strategic arms limitation talks of the late 1960s and late 1970s that happened between Russia and the US because of the existence of the nuclear weapons. I think OG is just highly worst case of how these nuclear weapons will work, and their principal argument, I'll just point out, isn't really a principal argument. Okay, firstly, on their principal argument, that is not a principal argument. First, I think their argument on morality is contingent on the practical. Why? Because if we can prove that a world without nuclear weapons would lead to lessened conflict and regional disparities, this would actually mean that nuclear weapons are not necessarily immoral. The second half of their principal argument, no thank you, is on fear. It is actually not true that citizens are fear-mongered in the status quo, and I think the flip is actually true. Because we pointed out that if we take an honest evaluation of our current society, due to mutually assured destruction, nobody actually thinks nuclear war will become a reality. Like when I hang out with Ethan and Hannah and Sean, I am not consistently scared to the point that Kim Jong-un will press a button and then Korea will be nuked. Like that is not the reality of a lot of these individuals that are living in these countries. Like that is just a weird principle to make in the first place. But by comparison, on their world, this fear-mongering is actually more possible because the absence of a clear, globally acknowledged deterrent might lead to, and are likely to lead to, heightened anxieties about the potential for larger-scaled conventional conflicts. The reason why this is exclusive then independent of Ethan's point about how war in and of itself is destructive, is because they themselves concede that nuclear wars, in Hannah's speech, can create instant, immense destruction. And we think this is why the strength of our mutually assured destruction is unique and far better on our side. Sure, the harms of war, again, are significant, but we've proven to you why mutually assured destruction is something that is unique on our side. I'll unpack why this is important later. Their better argument then is on smaller countries. I want to point out two things on their smaller countries then. The first thing I want to point out is that no conflict, literally no conflict that is prominent has happened using nuclear weapons between larger countries and smaller countries retrospectively. By comparison, the cases of larger countries engaging in conflict through conventional means have been universal and are likely to be even more egregious on their side, because OG does a lot to blame nuclear weapons, blame the people that created nuclear weapons, but never acknowledge that the same people could have made egregious weapons on their side of the house. Hannah's latched attempt is to claim that, oh, well, our benefits on nuclear weapon or like mutually assured destruction is likely not going to stand if our case is that weapons can be developed on their side. That is not true. That was a good attempt, but our case is that the uniqueness of nuclear weapons is extreme. They would still have cross-border conflict that is destructive on their side of the house. They cannot run away from that burden. The second thing I want to note is highlight the cases of smaller regional conflicts.
Sure.
This is very important because this is the majority of conflicts that have been happening after the nuclear bombings. In these cases, there have been significantly less wars and mass-scale conflicts due to the acknowledgement of not just nation-to-nation mutually assured destruction, even in the cases where smaller nations do not have nuclear weapons, but internationally mutually assured destruction as well. We pointed to examples such as India and Pakistan and received significantly underwhelming responses. Before I go on to Wang and their argument on intervention, go ahead.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, even if it ended well, it was weeks of the people in US living in heightened fear of being bombed any day with no return. Why is this world of fear a good thing?
Two things. Firstly, we've already proven to you why that's likely to be worse on your side of the house. And secondly, we've also proven to you that the state in which and the future that we're talking about is far better than the long-term impacts of your preferred world. That type of mutually assured destruction is unique to our side. Finally, on their argument on intervention, the first thing I want to point out is that the absence of nuclear weapons is likely to increase the perceived and internalized stakes of any military intervention. This is very important because without the fear of nuclear retaliations, nations might be less constrained in their use of force and could escalate conflicts more quickly, which means that interventions become riskier and potentially leading to larger scales of war. And that perception is what also leads to intervention being less likely on their side. But even on our worst case, on Wang, even if it is true that intervention itself is harder, what is important was our argument, that we took an honest look back at how we built our societies, that intervention is less likely to be necessary like we see in the status quo in the first place. And our argument to end the speech was very simple. Nuclear weapons serve and have retrospectively served as a powerful deterrent against potential aggressors because the fear of mutually assured destruction has historically and always will be contributing to global stability by preventing large-scale conflicts between nuclear-armed nations. On all those grounds, we have never been prouder to stand on opening opposition.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech, calling upon the Member of Government. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. If judges are ready, timer begins in 3, 2, and 1. Note, Judge, that opening Gov's explanation of first world countries is narrowed. Judge, while we do agree, we want to extend this point by stating that conflict is not between a big and small country through nuclear warfare, but the utilization of small countries as a mechanism for seemingly justified warfare. Two extensions. First, on the political monopolies caused by the rubber stamp theory, and second, on economic redistribution and changes in national identity that is crucial when it comes to a world without nuclear weapons. First, onto political monopolies caused by the rubber stamp theory. The premise here of this argument is that nuclear weapons in modern warfare is a symbol of power. Note here in the status quo that the development of nuclear technology requires a lot of government funding. The nations that can develop nuclear weapons to a vast degree are only first world countries, while third world countries don't have a budget and are unable to develop, hence creating a political monopoly revolving around first world countries where developing countries are dependent on nuclear holding countries. For example, the United States is a prominent
Point of
country
information.
development and a monopoly in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Note that the US has a rubber stamp over NATO. It's naive to think of it as an accountable democracy. A rubber stamp, Judge, is a political metaphor referring to a person or institution with considerably de jure power, but little de facto power, one that rarely or never disagrees with more powerful organizations and the creation of political monopolies. Countries cannot say no to what the US says since they are much more powerful, and countries are also dependent on the US as they provide security and trade within the economy. Now, what does this lead to? It leads to the US being able to use NATO as a cover to wage bad wars. The US using the advantage of having many countries by their side when they want a new political legislation or a
Point of
military
information.
to happen, to pass, will be able to pass any law or policy, since if something is approved by more countries, it seemingly is much more legitimate in the eye of political organizations, in global organizations as well. Note, Judge, that we believe that politicians often want to start wars out of self-interest, whether it be to benefit their oil stocks or to advance whatever personal crusade they believe in. For example, Trump's assassination of Qasem Soleimani to distract people from his impeachment, despite conflicting risks and a risk of war, is a clear example of how
Point of
NATO
information.
as a cover to wage bad wars. We believe that when nuclear weapons provide the actual tools for countries to do so, this becomes much more problematic, as we have seen with multiple examples as well. Two main impacts from this. One, it hinders the
Point of information.
world countries and blocks their views within international relations, as they have to support whatever cause a nuclear weapon holding country tells them. And second, it also impacts unjust wars from spreading through the rubber stamp. But before we move on to our second extension on economic redistribution, go ahead, POI.
The impact of your argument on political weaponry is derivative of OG and simply doesn't respond to the host of content we give you on why these issues of weaponry inequality increase, but simply just become more egregious on your side.
We believe that on two responses. One, the political metaphor of the rubber stamp makes it so that instead of having a country, of a small world country, being detrimentally harmed because a big country is actually using it as a weapon against them, we are using it as a reference to the way how within a political organization that is deemed as legitimate, it is actually not legitimate. So for example, with examples of NATO and how those are used as covers to wage bad wars. But now responding to the second response, which would also be responded by our second extension about economic redistribution, is that nuclear weapons significantly shape the national identity and international standings of a country that possesses them. We believe that when removing nuclear weapons, it necessitates a redefinition of nuclear identity for these countries. Look at Germany and Japan post-World War II and their transformation of national identities from militaristic power to champion a liberal internationalism and economical leadership transition. Look at the denuclearization of South Africa in the early 1990s being a potent example of voluntary dismantling that actually led to benefits of citizen-centered policies and economically centered policies that has not been actually developed in a world where nuclear warfare and nuclear weapon development has continuously taken up funds within governments. We are proud to propose.
I thank the member of government for their speech. Calling upon the member of opposition here.
All right, let me just get my timer out real quick. Give me all right, give me like 3 seconds. All right. I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this debate so far, there has been one key piece of accurate analysis that has been missing, and both teams contend on the basis of this analysis. In my speech today, I will be the first team that gives you clear and concise reasoning on why countries with nukes right now are more likely to be benevolent actors than not. Before that, a few pieces of setup and some rebuttal. First, I think something that has been agreed upon but needs to be reiterated is that society will necessarily reach a point where mutually assured destruction, I'm not going to say that 50 times, mad, is across the board, right? At that point, there's an equilibrium in our society because of everyone having the same upside potential to cause harm with nukes. Then necessarily actors in the state are forced to pursue other methods of conflict or diplomacy similar to the status quo, meaning that nukes have no weight on this world. Therefore, the first piece of unique analysis we give to leads us to a burden, which is that we need to weigh who creates the most net good in the period before that. Right? Before I move on to my extension, 2 pieces of rebuttal. First,
Go
we
on.
can concede that there is a risk of getting nuked, but the chances are so low. There is a risk of dying in any way. This ceiling that I'm sitting under could cave on me right now, but I don't worry about that because there's literally no chance of it happening. We will not live in fear of nukes because of the chances of them being so low, like used as so low because of mad treaties, right? So far, CG's speech has been a problem solution mismatch because they provide you with a legitimate phenomenon, which is NATO's rubber stamp
Yo,
with the US, but I'd like them to consider the fact that maybe it's not just the nukes, maybe it's the economic and non-nuclear sheer military power that the US possesses. So I think even in a world without nukes, this would be just as true. So I think like the weight that they have added to this debate is pretty much nothing right now. It's just derivative, right? What we hear in the opening half of opposition is that nukes allow benevolent actors to pursue diplomacy before NetMat. However, we never hear any analysis on why these actors are necessarily benevolent. We will uniquely prove this, which is a prerequisite to any of our opening benefits, so we weigh over them as our analysis is logically upstream. The analysis also allows us to weigh over the opening and closing government because we can hear the scary immense harm that these irrational big state actors can create and then bullying like small nations, and then we can prove that they're benevolent, right, which sort of weighs over everything. So with that in mind, onto my first extension, and if I have time for another on technological spillover, I'll get to it 5 minutes. I hate this, right? First, new presenting countries in the short term are more likely to be benevolent actors. This is because people have more money, there's less corruption, society is more technically advanced, meaning that they're more educated, rational, and independent actors because these are prerequisites for nukes. Since most countries with working and powerful nukes are beholden to their people, they are not likely to use them. However, at the point at which a country's people are aware, for example, WMD usage in foreign countries or genocidal actions, they are more open to retaliate, meaning that there is a self-correcting mechanism which allows for inherent checks and balances to ensure that there's no bullying of smaller nations and ensure that net good is created. I'll take it in a minute, stop badgering. These countries also need to be democratic or rational to survive in the liberal international order, i.e. North Korea and Russia are sanctioned like hell. 70 to 90% of Russia's nukes don't even work at this point. They are not a major threat, right? These rational countries, as already conceded, also have the ability to delay NetMad to the point at which all countries are rational, like the initial pressures and JCPOA with US-Iran relations. Even worse, in let's engage in the very worst case of self-interested hegemonies like China with nukes. They are rational. Yet another piece of unique analysis that we push is that it is in their interest to present themselves as benevolent and a moral police because that allows them to succeed internationally. It looks like even China brokering peace in the Middle East, rationalized countries are not advancing them. I'll take your POI.
Russia and Ukraine prove that nukes don't stop ground conflict. The difference then is that no one can interfere for fear of Russia using its nuclear weapons. Are you actually stopping?
Okay, I got it, right? Okay, so firstly, 70% of Russia's nukes don't even work, right? And secondly, there has been lots of intervention. And I don't think the reason that no one has sent troops on the ground to Ukraine is because of fear of retaliation. I think it's more that no one wants to incur that cost on themselves, right? The more developed countries, therefore, are able to leverage their nukes as an effective tool to spread democracy or stop genocide, for example, as they are simply an agent of their people. Finally, on technological advancement, when MAD is a given, right? At this point, our unique comparison is that we're living in the same world pretty much. However, on our side, uniquely, you have the Iran and China deal with 11 billion invested into the development of nukes, right? At this point, you upskill and hire workers. You create development and there's spillover in knowledge and educated workers, right? And then we're able to, at the same point, right, reuse this money that in their status quo will be used on meaningless weapons to, at the same time, educate, upskill workers, and also solve our energy crisis by advancing nuclear, right? So I think as a whole, our benefits just outweigh them as entirely, and a lot of our claims are the prerequisite for theirs. So I think we way over everyone in this debate so far. Thank you for your time. Vote closing.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech, calling upon the proposition whip here.
Okay. Just a sec, I'm setting up my timer. Okay. If judges are ready and opponents are ready, my timer will start in 3, 2, 1, go. A clarification before going on. The closing opposition states that our extension upon the political monopoly is also happening on our side of the house without nuclear weapons, such as economic power difference. First, we don't need to prove any form of exclusivity, right? All we need to prove is that it's worse on the opposition bench, which we already have done for the clarification, right? They provide that additional upper hand to the first world countries through providing them with nuclear technology and nuclear weapons that third world countries cannot gain, and hence they're strengthening the power difference. Second, we have already talked about why we solve this economic power difference through forcing the economic redistribution when nuclear weapons are taken away, hence mediating any other forms that might create a political monopoly on our side. Pushing that to the side, as the whip speaker, I'd like to go over number one, why we win over the opening side of the government bench, and second of all, why we win over the opening on the opposition bench within this debate. So firstly, why do we win over the side of opening governments, right? Their contentions were regarding the threats of a global war when nuclear weapons are developed, and how first world countries will create conflicts with third world countries using the power that they gained from nuclear weapons. Why do we win? Number one, their entire case is a negative case without any proof on why proposition prevents these conflicts. Second, the difference in the magnitude of impacts, right? Firstly, their contentions are regarding the harms that will occur on the opposition bench without providing any form of reasoning on why a world without nuclear weapons on the proposition world will not have any form of conflict. Why do we win? Because we provide you with that constructive extension that they failed to do. We provide you with the extension of changes of the national identity that countries are associated with nuclear weapons in the status quo. Those countries will lose that negative image amongst the global community. Hence, it fosters international relationships as well as because first world countries lose that image of that quote unquote powerful country with nuclear weapons, it decreases the power gap between the first and third world countries, hence mediating the chances of conflict on the world of proposition. No matter how much they cut down opposition's case with their contentions and they win over the side of opening opposition without any form of constructive point, they cannot win over our side, the closing government, when we have provided that extension for them. Second, the difference in the magnitude of impacts. Like our member of government already stated, the entire opening government's bench is only focused on the idea of first world countries having conflicts with third world countries in terms of military conflicts. Why do we win? We provide you with the same analysis, but we extend that magnitude by actually proving why these happen in the first place through the extra analysis of the rubber stamp theory, how this motion affects the political system itself. Right? The idea of military conflicts can only exist under the premise of the rubber stamp theory that the political monopoly is formed. When that premise is true, only can the military conflict idea can stand. As they have already given you 0 layers of analysis upon this premise, whereas we have within our extension of the rubber stamp theory,
Point of information.
Government. Second, why do we win over the side of opening opposition, right? Their sole contention was the deterrence of conflicts, and hence they're able to achieve international security. Why do we win? Number one, their sole contention cannot even stand from the first place. And second of all, even if this deterrence was to exist on their world, the deterrence present on our side, on the closing government, is the one with decreased backlashes and ethical violations. Number one, their sole contention cannot even stand in the first place.
Point of
Right?
information.
Countries can use nuclear weapons to threat aggressive nations. They call this and sugarcoat it as deterrence. Judge, the action of threatening itself is a form of conflict. Conflicts do not have to be a full-on nuclear war. The tension between two nations and the instability of international relationships, that in itself is a conflict. For example, the Cold War. The Cold War is clarified as a conflict despite having no real military aggression. And second of all, even if this deterrence was to exist on their world, our deterrence that we provide to you has significantly less harms. Right?
Point of information.
I'll take that later, form of implicit aggression, right? Threatening aggressive countries to prevent conflict. The deterrence we have on our side is regarding fostering international relationships and not threatening, but encouraging the aggressive to not use the nuclear weapons, right? Through getting rid of the negative national identity or image of a country that originally owned nuclear
Point of
weapons.
information.
Away that dominant narrative of countries that own nuclear weapons so they can no longer use that nuclear weapon. We solve this issue. I'd like to take the POI.
You can mention the rubber stamp theory, we can mention the divided government theory. In this way, theories don't win you debates. For the first time in CG, can you actually weigh your case against your opening and weigh your case against the host of mad content that we give to you?
Okay, It's the part that we are weighing, right? The deterrence on your side is through the method of breaking international relationships and threatening aggressive nations, while our deterrence on the side of closing governments is on the base of fostering international relationships. So even if this deterrence was to exist on both sides of the house, the lack of harms on our side of the house is what wins us this narrative, this comparative, and this clash, right? Thirdly, why do we win over the side of closing opposition? Because of their absence of their unique extension, right? Their quote-unquote extension is that they create more jobs to create these nuclear wars, and hence they create economic benefits. Judge, we don't see how in any way economic benefits or creating more jobs is really necessary when the opening side has already talked about the economic benefits they bring, as well as when there is imminent chances of global nuclear wars, as well as international relationships failing. We don't see how creating more jobs has far more of an impact compared to the contentions that have already came out in the opening side of this debate, as well as our side on the closing governments. They have boxed themselves out of this debate. So what have we proved to you in my speech? We have proved their burden of affecting as much people as possible, the vulnerable stakeholders, to a much bigger magnitude compared to the remaining three sides. Never so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the proposition whip. To conclude the debate, calling upon the opposition whip speaker. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are. When we are ready.
Okay. My pronouns are he, him. Prefer my POIs verbally. I will not be checking chat. Let's turn off the AC instead of kind of chilling. Oh, hey, where's the AC? Not bad. I was getting goosebumps, you know. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. With opening government repeating Russia and Ukraine like a mantra and closing government yapping about rubber stamps, no side so far has given you an analysis that directly connects to nuclear weapons like we have. I think it's so obvious who takes this debate. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, on some clarifications. Secondly, to address government whip. And thirdly, on 2 clashes to close out this debate. First off, I want to tackle OG's example of Ukraine and Russia and offer a new piece of analysis on why it does not actually work. Okay, so in every world imaginable, I want to make it clear that Russia will be the dominant player in the world regardless. Within that, being a dominant player, even if limited to conventional weapons, other countries will not be willing to risk their necks for Ukraine's sake. The unique benefit in our world, however, the delta, is that Russia cannot infringe upon other bordering countries such as Finland or Poland, right? I mean, Putin has repeatedly mentioned his ambition of Russia taking back old Soviet borders unions, right? And the reason he cannot aim for this larger goal is due to the fact that NATO countries are protected by the threat of nukes. That is the difference on our side, even with their cherry-picked example. But let's quickly address government whip, right? They start out their speech by talking about how they don't have to prove exclusivity, they just have to prove that we're bad. I find it quite wild that they're able to make a claim like this because the whole purpose of the debate is to prove why one side is significantly worse than the other, right? They can't come up here and say that, oh, opposition is bad, without proving why this bad thing does not exist on their side of the house. We find this a very lazy response to our analysis on this rubber stamp point that he brought up, not being exclusive to our side. Now, let's go on to some clashes. First off, on democratic spread. Closing government's main extension is that the US utilizes nukes as a mechanism to enforce this dictatorship within NATO, right? That's the whole rubber stamp thing. Few issues with this. First off, their analysis on the US does not take into account that the policies that they support are usually beneficial. I mean, their whole foreign diplomacy policy is spreading democracy to other countries and ensuring the upholding of these democratic values. This is simply due to the beliefs of its citizens affecting its foreign policy, right? That's the unique extension we gave. I think that they are Secondly, I think they're just grossly overestimating the power that the US holds in organizations like NATO. Yes, US, Russia, and China are very prominent and dominant players in geopolitics, but you need to realize that these large countries, these dominant countries, are kept in check by other countries like the UK, France, etc., right? This that they will not be able to propose a policy so terrible as to have a massive impact on society, as then the collective of the other countries will then keep in check. Thus, even if they're case, the delta on their side is not that big. But even if you buy that the US is so dictatorial, I think that this is not just a product of them owning nukes, but just being so much more technologically advanced, right? I mean, they spend so much money on the military, and we don't see this changing just because nukes don't exist. But let's actually look at the content that we offered you, Judge. My member told you that these countries that are so powerful basically act as a moral police and enforce certain policies, right? We think this is a crucial mechanism in spreading democracy, as without this tool of nuclear weapons and dictators and despots will have no incentive to follow along in these more humanitarian policies. And yeah, government whip tries to tell us that we're sugarcoating the threat of nuclear weapons as a tool, but that the regional instability that we cause is actually conflict in and of itself. But they talk about how bad the Cold War was to back this up, right? Well, our response to that is that we will take a Cold War to an actual war where human lives are spent or are wasted any day. And that's bringing us to our second clash on human death. But before that, a quick POI.
It's true that Russia can't infringe upon NATO countries, but how do you plan to help vulnerable countries that aren't in nuclear umbrellas like Ireland or Sweden?
Okay, I already told you that on either side of the house, there will be vulnerable countries. There will be vulnerable countries with less power, except that on your side, it's more likely that conflict will escalate. I've already addressed this before. Now, on to our last clash about human death. Opening government comes up here and tells us that nuclear weapons allow these more powerful countries to bully the weaker ones, which causes casualties, and this results in peace being forcibly broken over and over again. 2 layers of analysis on this. We want to note that their characterization of these more developed countries with nuclear bombs is completely unfair. And they frame it as if all the countries with nuclear bombs, or countries like China and Russia, attempted to bully Ukraine or Taiwan into submission, right? This is simply wrong, as the majority of countries that are more democratic countries in power, the examples that Prime Minister gives, USA, France, UK, etc., are all those with more democratic principles, right? But secondly, even if you believe this wild characterization that all these countries with nukes are mean bullies, we would rather have these countries be able to use nukes as a threat than other more conventional measures, right? Because in both worlds, there will be a power imbalance between countries, i.e. the US will be dominating the world without nukes. In Prop's world, these more dominant countries then, who are so evil as they characterize, will use measures of the conventional nature to threaten other weaker countries. I think the problem we see here is that nukes are a much more effective threat, right? I mean, even if threatened with conventional warfare, it's more likely that the weaker country will fight back, and then war will ensue. Under comparative, then, our world is the one with less human death. Our world is the one with less direct war, and this is why we win this debate. I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank all the speakers for their speech. Thank you for a great debate. I'll request my other judges to join me in the judges' room so we can deliberate.
Thank you for the
Hey,
debate,
y'all,
guys.
thank you for the date. It was
Thanks
kinda
for the round.
Thank you.
I love y'all.